Hi, it's Mike McLoone from Studio Wizards. I made this video to talk about EQ because this is a question that comes up quite often when people are in the studio about tracking EQ, basically for mixing purposes. I'm not going to go into the mastering EQ just now, but just for mixing. So my main advice about EQ is the best EQ you can possibly use is probably no EQ at all. If you can actually get the track, the sound to the place you want it to be when you're writing, that's the best way to do it, and not to start using an EQ later on to start unmasking things and try to make things clearer. The absolute best thing you can do is, if you've got creative control over the track, is to use octaves to pitch the elements, the parts, so that they don't clash in the first place, so that you don't have to use any kind of EQ or processing to make them clearer. This is how, for example, classical music was written for hundreds of years with no EQ, and everything works because each instrument has its own frequency range, and this is known by the composer, and they are able to use this octaves to actually write the music so that you don't have to actually do any processing afterwards. And it's the same thing for writing your own music, if it's electronic or if it's rock or whatever it is. The best thing you can do is to write the music so you won't have to fix it later on. So that means experimenting with different octaves of the different elements so that there is no clashing in the frequencies to begin with. If you don't have creative control and you're mixing a track from somebody else, then maybe you might have to start doing some juggling like this of the frequencies, but that's a last resort, basically. The main EQ I would generally recommend, or generally always use on a track, is a basic filter, like a high-pass filter. This is the most useful part of any EQ that you're ever going to use, is the high-pass filter. So get very familiar with it. This was a very prominent feature on the big consoles. People like this high-pass filter. So around 90, from 90 to 100 hertz, you're going to basically high-pass filter almost every part of the mix except for the kick drum and the bass guitar, and if it's an electronic track, the bass line. And so everything else, practically everything else, is going to have like a 90 or 100 hertz high-pass filter, if not going even higher. You might want to go 150, you might go 200, you might go 250. It depends. If you're taking raw acoustic guitar or electric guitar parts, you might stick a 250 high-pass filter on it, because it's going to create a lot of bass energy that's just going to suck the mix down. You're not going to get the kick and the bass to pop through like you want. It's going to zap a lot of the energy from the playback system in trying to reproduce those low frequencies from the guitar parts, which aren't actually probably going to drive the mix. They're probably not actually part of the main rhythm of the mix in that way. So just stick a simple advice: if you really have to EQ something, or the most useful thing you can use in the EQ toolbox is like a 90 hertz high-pass filter on everything except the kick, bass, and maybe some other elements that are absolutely important that they come through on a subwoofer or whatever it is, but everything else just high-pass filter it. The other thing you can get away with instead of using EQ is compression and leveling. Just use the faders, just use the level, the gain, and if something is too prominent, the simplest thing you can do is just bring it down in volume rather than EQing it down. The general tip is, if you have a busy mix, then you're going to have more elements more brighter elements in overall, which is a bit contradictory, but it kind of works like that, because if you start dulling down the individual tracks in a busy mix, it becomes unclear. You kind of end up having to have bright elements, but that's again a part of the writing. If you're recording an acoustic guitar, for example, you can decide at the beginning to not use a mic, which is going to pick up all that bass, like 200, 150 hertz mud that you probably don't want. So you can choose a mic which will provide that filtering from the beginning. It won't actually pick up that. It won't be on the recording. You don't have to high-pass filter it later on. If you are using a synthesizer, you can also use the filter in the synthesizer, which is in itself the nuts and bolts of an EQ. I mean, an EQ is just several filter sections layered together. So in a synthesizer, you already have a subtractive synthesizer. You have an EQ built in that you have a filter section on the output. You have you can set up a high pass filter to get rid of the mud. You can set up the low pass filter to get the sound where you want it to be, so that you don't really need to use an EQ afterwards. That's the simple general advice about EQ. Now, if you have a track that maybe you got from someone else, you've got no choice in the creative writing process, and you do need to mix it to blend it together, okay, well then you might have to use some EQs. The first thing I would start with is shelving EQ, because this is much easier to set up, and it provides a more natural kind of tonal balance in some ways. So I'm just talking about a simple shelf where you might add from 3.5K a little bit of high frequency, or subtract a little bit of high frequency, or the bass from 250 you might subtract quite a lot depending, or maybe you add, but that's more rare, I guess, adding too much in the bass. Shelving filters are basically the easiest way of EQing, because you're covering a very large bandwidth without having to go in individually and pinpoint individual frequencies to subtract or add and so on. So because the music is not just a sine wave that you're EQing, it's not just one frequency at one point where you can go in with a notch filter and just plus or minus it. Real music is moving in frequency, so the simplest way is just using a shelf, high shelf or low shelf, to just nudge those things that you want to get in the background. Just maybe nudge the high frequencies down a little bit. The stuff that you want to get in the foreground, nudge the high frequencies up a little bit, and you get that little bit of separation without having to go in and individually EQ individual notes. The other type of EQ is a parametric, and this is requires a bit more setting up, and you actually you have to know what you're doing with the parametric EQ, because it's not just about getting the graphical EQ that you have nowadays and just dragging around with the mouse until something sounds good. The correct way to set up a parametric EQ is you set a fairly rough bandwidth, like a Q factor of, let's say, around 1 or less than 1, which is kind of rounded. You do a lot at extreme plus or extreme minus, depending on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to add or bring out a certain frequency, or you're trying to get rid of a certain frequency, you're going to do an extreme of that, maybe plus 10 or minus 10. And then you're going to use the frequency control of that parametric EQ and sweep it around until you hear exactly, okay, that one frequency is now, it's centered on that, or it's now centered on the frequency you want to cut out. And then you put the gain back to 0, because now you've got the frequency correct, and you set the Q to whatever you want. If you're going to do a big cut, you're going to use a high Q, like anything above 1.0. So it might be 2, it might be 3. It depends on how surgical you want to get, maybe up to 5 even. If you want to do an addition, if you want to bring out something and say like a bit of air or high frequency in a vocal or something like this, then you're going to use a Q less than 1. It generally sounds more natural. It's kind of getting back to the same as the shelving, because a Q of 1 or less has a much wider area in which it's boosting or cutting, which is more natural, because the music is, again, it's jumping around in notes and frequency. So you don't want to just boost one note, you want to boost that instrument. So you've got to cover basically a certain range. So less than 1 Q is wider and covering a larger range, and more than 1 is more surgical for the cuts. So once you get the frequency that you want to boost or cut, and you set the Q to what you think it should be, first of all, and then you can start using the gain, the plus minus. And again, if you find that you're using like 3 or 4 of these parametric EQ moves on an element, and you're using gigantic cuts or boosts like +5 or +6 or -10 or something like that, you might want to go back and just try and figure out if you can get a better sound to begin with. Because if you get into this territory of really trying to mold the elements of the mix using an EQ, there's something wrong with the elements of that mix. That's basically what it means. If the tracking was good, and if the writing even of the electronic parts and the patches that you're using were correct or in the ballpark, you should be able just to put faders up, and that track should sound pretty good. With those raw elements, you shouldn't have to go in and start tweaking things like to an extreme. So the best type of EQ is, again, just none. If you can get away with none, just a high pass filter, just to cut the bass, whatever, and make it clean, that's the best type of EQ.